I have two questions. One is to do with slaves. I do understand the need and why it works.
One thing what we need to realize, Brother Ali, is this. We're talking about a very different environment of the 7th century. And this is the amazing thing. As difficult as it might be for us to fully comprehend and understand these issues, whenever you ask somebody who is either skeptical or doubtful of these issues, what would be a better way of resolving these issues, they are blank. They have no answer. Because the reality is that the environment of the time, the limitation of resources, the limitation of different types of facilities that would be necessary perhaps to have an alternate, this was the best way of handling the situation at the time. But, from our modern perspective, the ulama generally agree that even without this concept, Islam is complete. It is not incumbent upon us as Muslims as a duty to involve in these particular solutions that were given at a specific time and a specific place.
Like there were problems in the society and Islam came with the best solution. So we have to keep that in mind. For example, the problem with what to do with war prisoners. So Islam came with this concept that you can have them instead of, there were no prisons. But subhanAllah, even if you think it would be better than like locking them in an area where they live under difficult conditions in the desert, then like assigning them to a family where they eat the same that the house owner eats, wear the same than the house owner wears. And then Islam did not stop there and said, okay, this is a solution to this problem. But Islam even introduced solution to stop slavery, like globally even, subhanAllah, by encouraging in everything the freeing of slaves. Even I think when you make an oath by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you break it, so if you have a slave, you can free it, then you're forgiving. And other things were solved by freeing slaves, and great reward was promised like to Muslims freeing slaves. So I think even in the points where it was allowed, it was for the benefit even for those people themselves, subhanAllah. And it was never the case that Islam told you, like other societies, like the Western society, for example, that you can go and enslave people in a time of peace, that you can take someone because of his race or something. The Islamic concept had nothing to do with race. You couldn't just take people because of their race, because you think they're inferior to you or something, and you think that you're superior, and take them as slaves.
The word slavery, when we're using the word in the West, has a certain meaning. And you can't apply that meaning to what Islam is talking about. It's more like an indentured servitude. So pre-Islam, you could go along and you could enslave anyone. You're walking along, you're stronger, you just take them, you can enslave them, no problem. Doesn't matter what the situation is, you just go and take whoever you want and you can enslave them. According to whatever you enslave people. So there were Persians were enslaved, white people were enslaved, black people were enslaved. It wasn't a race-based thing. When Islam came, one of the first things the Prophet peace be upon him did is he restricted the mechanism of which you could enslave a person or put them into indentured servitude by saying the only people that are allowed to be held like this are war captives. All the other streams of people that were taken, so you couldn't go into a land and just take people. You weren't allowed to do this, which is what the Western, transatlantic slave trade was all about. And you weren't allowed to do this. The only people you would potentially who fall into this category are the people you had a war with. Now, there was reasons for this as well. So first, other avenues are taken away. There's no other avenues for this. The second thing is that the only avenue now left is enslaving. So in war. So what happens when the Arabs often went to battle to motivate themselves, they would bring their families and their wealth with them. There are many examples, if you see this in the Hadith, there are many examples of tribes coming with, and this was designed to motivate the men who are fighting to fight strongly because they would know that their families because that was the way that the things happened in that scenario. And these women would often dress up and beautify. And because this is an age of empire, they would often be in their best dress, etc., because this is to motivate their men. Now, what would happen is in the battle, if an enemy was defeated and the men have either they've been killed or they've run away, then you're left with on the battlefield really all of these children and women and all of this money. What happened to that? So often people bring some hadith that show this in a negative light. So let me give a scenario where there was a battle and there were women and children, there was wealth. So the Prophet peace be upon him took them into custody. So they were in the battlefield area. Now in that time, nothing can happen. There can be no dissemination of the women or the children or the wealth at all. That cannot happen. It has to happen outside of that area. So what happens was that the Prophet peace be upon him waited, and they were asking the Prophet, what were you waiting for? I said, I'm waiting for the men who are left to come back and ask for their family or their wealth back. So the Prophet peace upon him waited in the area. The people returned, I think after a few days. So they're waiting in this area for a few days. So they're feeding these people, looking after them, no distribution, etc. that's happening. And then when the men came, a delegation came, what they said was that, we've come for our women and children. So the Prophet gave them a choice. You can either have your honor, meaning your families, or you can have your wealth. Now, you have to imagine, you've already defeated these people in battle. They can do nothing to sort of force you into. You are completely in power. You can keep both. You don't have to give anything, right? You don't have to give them anything. No, go away. We're not interested. We've got what we wanted. You guys lost, leave. But the Prophet said, this is a choice I'm giving you. And they said, okay, no, we will take our family. So their families were returned to them. Everyone was returned to them. And it's very interesting in this, if you read in detail about this, the women were asked, do you want to go back to your families? Imagine this question, being asked, do you actually want to go back to your families? Then they were returned to their families. And this is that scenario. And there's lots of rules associated with this. So if a husband and wife are captured together, then nikah it remains and they are allowed to carry on as husband and wife. Nothing happens to them. If the husband is killed, obviously there's no marriage remaining. And if the husband is absent, is no longer available, not around anymore, he doesn't come back, and the people leave the area, they go to another place now. Traveling distance is like months to travel. You understand? It's not like a 1 or 2 days. So they move to a completely different place. So effectively, this marriage is no longer subsisting because it's disbanded. So essentially, a parallel of this is in Islam, if you're away from your wife for more than 4 months, she has the right to ask for divorce on this basis because you're not with her. Do you understand? The other things are that there's an iddah period that has to take place. So you have to allow the next menstrual cycle to occur before there would be any chance of this sort of happening. Now I want to put some other things in place. There was a family who had 7 brothers, and they had 1 slave girl. There's a famous, people are aware of this. And the youngest brother slapped the slave girl for whatever reason, and so she went to the Prophet peace be upon him, and she complained that this person slapped me. And Prophet peace be upon him called the men. They all explained the situation, but they said, please, she's our only slave. We have no one else to cook for us, and do these things. But the Prophet peace be upon him said, free her. Now I want you to put in your mind, if the Prophet peace be upon him is ordering these brothers to free a slave for slapping her, would he allow them to rape her? It's not even consideration, right? It's not even consideration. If you look at how the Quran talks about slavery, there's many rules that are given within it, and there's many hadith that we have about this. But there's a very interesting which surah? I think it's Surah Balad, where Allah talks about I've given you eyes, a tongue, and 2 lips, and I've shown you the 2 paths, but you don't take the higher path. And then the next ayah, do you even know what the higher path is? So Allah talks about 2 ways that He has guided the people to take, and there is a higher path. And what is the higher path? To free the necks, or free the slaves. So the higher path in Islam is to free the slaves. And Brother Erfan mentioned that there is hadith after hadith how the Prophet gave rulings of, if this happens, you free the slave. If you slander your slave, you free them. Imagine slandering your slave, you free them. And the other thing is that Quran talks specifically about contracts that you have. If a slave asks you for a contract to free them, you have to allow them that contract. If a slave wants to marry another slave, you have to facilitate this. Imagine this. You have to facilitate this marriage. Now, in those scenarios where there is attraction between the 2 parties and there is consent, they're allowed to have they're allowed to sleep with each other. Now the question is, okay, what happens to the nikah in this scenario? Why is there no nikah in this scenario? And Brother Abbas has alluded to this, that the nikah is really a transaction between the guardian, usually the father, and the man who's marrying your daughter, to say that I have guardianship and responsibility and care. I'm now passing that to you. And this is done with the consent of the person who's getting married. Now, when that guardianship has already been allocated, you are already now the guardian for this person, you are meeting all of their needs, etc. Then the only thing that's required is the consent of that individual, and you can have relations with them. Now, in today's world, this seems a little bit odd, but if you look in that situation, you've moved away from whichever place you are. Your family either dead or they're gone. You're living with this family. You have all these abilities to free yourself, work for your freedom. You have these abilities to make contracts to leave, etc. Earn your way out of this sort of servitude. And there's many. I mean, there's too many to list. But if you end up in a household and you have some connection with the person and you have interaction with them in a physical way with your consent, that would be considered to be okay behavior, normal behavior. But there's so many caveats in this that it's really to understand that this was a solution to the problem of there being no prisons. So in those days, there weren't prisons. You couldn't imprison people. What that happened to them is they were placed into homes where they would be servitude. They are doing hard work, obviously not beyond their means, because there are also rules about this. But you're in a family and you're working in that family environment, and you eat what people eat, you wear what they wear. If the work is too much for you, then the Prophet advised the people to help the people with their work. So it was not really this case. Umar, when he went to Palestine, and he was on, that he was sharing his camel with his servant. And imagine this now: one's a servant, and you're the Khalifa. But what you're doing is you're sharing the right, because this is the just thing. This is how you treat the individual. And even when they got to the time of going into the city, and the slave said, "You know, actually, you should be on the camel when we go in." And what did Umar radiallahu anhu said? He said, "No, no, it's your turn."
Beautiful.
So imagine that you walk into, now you're the ruler of the Muslim lands, you conquered Palestine, and you're going into the city, and you're being seen by all of the highest echelons of their society, the priest, the etc. You're walking, and your servant is on the camel because it's this turn. So this
Yeah,
whole
this we-
concept is very, very nuanced, and there's no idea that you would be mistreating the people. If the Prophet peace be upon him didn't allow a person to be slapped, he would not allow them to be assaulted.